Some of you may have noticed in the About section of my channel that I say that I'm an Orthodox Christian. Some of you also may noticed that I'm citing the colonial charters from the very beginning of the 17th century, the American Colonial Charters, and doing excerpts from them. And some of you also may have realized, but wait, those colonial charters were granted by an Anglican, an Anglo king, not an overtly Orthodox king. Although we could say that that Anglican Anglo king was trying to walk a very fine line with his subjects between Anglicanism and Catholicism. Anglicanism, of course, was very much in its infancy at this point in time. It was very recent to the European religious landscape. But there's no mention or no influence of orthodoxy in Orthodox Christianity in Anglicanism, or if you want to throw in there Lutheranism or Catholicism. However, I would make this remark. The Anglicans knew well, and as did the Lutherans, that there was something wrong with Catholicism, Roman Catholicism. Now, Anglicanism, the argument could be made, and it's a debatable topic, that it was more of a politically motivated creation. Okay. Regardless, I make note that, well, first of all, in the case of Lutheranism, but again, Lutheranism is a much more continental phenomenon, that, and if you want to research this, as they call it, the Tübingen Fathers from Tübingen University, if you will, disciples of Luther, corresponding, they didn't come to an agreement, of course, with, but corresponding nonetheless, I believe there's over 400 pages of letters over an 8-year period in the late 1500s, the correspondence with Patriarch Jeremias of Constantinople. It's not unreasonable to think that Anglican theological theologians, let's say, were aware of this dialogue. But the biggest thing about this between Anglicanism and Orthodoxy, the relationship, one has to go to actually as late as the early 20th century, where there was quite robust dialogue theologically between Anglicans and Orthodox. There's lots of Russian Orthodox theologians that have written voluminously about this. Now, there's great debate about whether or not, theologically, Anglicanism is in agreement. Of course, we know through the 20th century that Anglicanism kind of, in large part, with a very notable exception, went off the rails theologically, so much so that they have, openly homosexual bishops, female bishops, so on and so forth, that once that started, Orthodox Christianity basically said, we can no longer, even recognize this. But the notable exception I mentioned earlier was the person of N.T. Wright. N.T. Wright, who, if I'm not mistaken, passed recently, may his memory be eternal, in many bilateral conferences between Orthodox and Anglican theologians, he would be very much featured at them. And this was, within the last decade. N.T. Wright was often asked at the end of a presentation on his theological understanding of God and man and Christ and the relationship between Christ and man and so on and so forth. Because what he was presenting and what he was saying was so orthodox, he was often asked, why don't you just become Orthodox? Because your theology is so orthodox. And he said, basically, I'm paraphrasing, of course, that, I was born into the Anglican confession. I'm trying to stay in the Anglican confession and speak truth to it. Within Anglicanism, you could consider him somewhat like the prophets of the Old Testament, ones that were speaking in the wilderness, and or John the Baptist, in trying to shake and get repentance within the theological and Christian community that they were a part of. So, given all of this, it is not far-fetched to say that if there was a very concentrated effort at dialogue between the Anglicans of the early 17th century, late 16th century, and the Orthodox of that same time period, that there could not have been an understanding and been unification between the two. And in fact, I also note that in the early 20th century, maybe late 19th century, that the Western Rite Orthodox movement that was kind of blessed off on by none other than Saint Tikhon of Moscow took the Anglican liturgical services, removed some of the problem areas of them. Yes, there were. Not going to gloss over that. But in large part kept them basically the same. And it birthed the Western Rite Orthodox movement in a way that's still in Rokor Orthodox, Antiochian Orthodox, all these different places, is alive and well. So all of this to say that, yes, the colonial charters were granted by an Anglican Anglo-King monarch. But yet, if the communication had happened at the time between the Orthodox and the Anglicans robustly, it may have been that what they were teaching and what they thought and what their theology was pretty much the same. And not a lot of contradiction, not a lot of dissonance. So I say all that to say that we don't really know what that would have looked like because it didn't happen historically. But we should not just out of hand say, well, that's Anglican and that's no good. I think we have to pause there. Anyway, just food for thought about some questions that I've been asked sometime about some of the ideas that I presented to some people. Okay, until next time.